Hey everyone, I've been working as a security guard for over 15 years now. I've seen some weird things during my time on the job, stuff that would make most people's skin crawl, but nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to what I experienced at the Reilly Museum of Curiosities. I'm writing this down because I still can't fully process what happened, and maybe putting it out there will help me make some sense of it. Or maybe someone out there has gone through something similar. I don't know, but here it goes. So, a few months back I took a job at this old museum. It wasn't like any museum I'd worked at before. The place has been around since the 1800s and has this creepy reputation in town. You know the type: dark corners, creaky floors, and dust-covered exhibits that make you feel like the past is just inches away from reaching out and grabbing you. People in town whispered about the strange things that happen there after dark, but I figured it was all just stories to keep kids from sneaking in. Besides, it was a steady job and I've handled plenty of night shifts before, so I wasn't too worried. But the Reilly Museum of Curiosities wasn't just any job. The place was like something straight out of a horror movie. The building itself was this massive, Gothic-style structure with gargoyles perched on the corners of the roof, and ivy crawling up the walls like it was trying to escape. Inside, the exhibits were a mix of the bizarre and the unsettling: taxidermy animals with too many eyes, shrunken heads, ancient torture devices, you name it. But the weirdest part wasn't the exhibits or even the building itself. It was the security briefing. On my first day, the head of security handed me this list of rules. Now, I've had my share of quirky job requirements before, but these were something else. They weren't just guidelines, they felt more like warnings. And as he handed me that list, I swear he looked at me with a mix of pity and fear. Here they are. Rule 1. Don't patrol outside between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m., and don't patrol inside the museum between 10 p.m. and 12 a.m. Rule 2. All security guards must be in the security room before 3 a.m. Rule 3. Do not look outside the security room window. All blinds should be pulled down. Rule 4. When you're patrolling the museum, if you hear crying, don't flash your torchlight, just walk away. Rule 5. You must open the Bible to the marked page daily before 3 a.m. The Bible will mysteriously close every day. Weird, right? I'm a professional though, so I figured they had these rules for a reason and I wasn't about to test them. For the first few months I stuck to the routine like glue. Honestly, it wasn't so bad. Sure, there was an eerie feeling here and there like someone was watching me, but other than that, nothing really happened. Until it did. It was the first of the month. A date that had a weird significance in the museum's history, though I didn't know it at the time. The air that night felt different, heavier somehow. It was as if the entire museum was holding its breath, waiting for something. I made my rounds following the same path I always did. But something was off. I walked past the doll room, the one that always gave me the creeps, and felt a chill run down my spine. But I kept walking, forcing myself not to look inside. Then I passed the art room, where all the old paintings and sculptures were kept. And that's when I heard it. A faint cry, like a woman in distress, coming from the corner of the room. My heart started pounding in my chest. Now, normally I would have followed the rule and ignored it. After all, that was what they told us to do. But something, curiosity, maybe stupidity, made me stop. And then I did the one thing I swore I wouldn't do. I turned and shined my flashlight in that direction. Big mistake. The beam of light cut through the darkness, landing on a figure in the corner. It was a woman, at least it looked like a woman. She was pale, almost translucent, with long white hair that hung down in tangled strands. Her dress was torn and dirty, like she'd been wearing it for centuries. And she was covering her face, sobbing into her hands. I stood there, frozen, my breath caught in my throat. But then she looked up. Her hands dropped away, revealing a face that wasn't quite human. Her eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to suck in the light from my flashlight. But what made my blood run cold was the way she looked at me. It wasn't just a glance. It was like she could see into my soul, see every fear, every mistake I'd ever made. And then she screamed. It wasn't a human scream, it was something else, something primal and inhuman. The sound tore through me, sending me into a blind panic. I turned and ran, sprinting down the hallway towards the security room. I could hear her behind me, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. And then, just as I reached the door, I felt a cold hand brush against the back of my neck. I threw myself into the security room, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I could still hear her outside, scratching at the door, banging on it like she was trying to break it down. But after what felt like hours, she finally stopped. The silence was almost worse than the noise. I could feel her out there waiting. I tried to calm myself down, to convince myself that it was over, but I knew better. Something had changed. The rules were there for a reason, and I'd broken one of them. And now I was going to pay for it. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. I kept my eyes on the clock, watching as it ticked closer and closer to 3 a.m. That was when the unease started to creep in. The air in the room became heavy, almost suffocating, like something was pressing down on me. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath. And then I heard it, the sound of tiny footsteps echoing in the hallway. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But then I heard it again, louder this time and closer. My heart was in my throat as I turned towards the door, and that's when I noticed something truly terrifying. The blinds on the window were slowly rising on their own. I scrambled to pull them back down, but it was too late. As the blinds lifted, I saw something outside. The window was supposed to look out onto the museum grounds, but instead, it showed a dark, endless void. And in that void, dozens of faces appeared, pale, lifeless faces of children, their eyes hollow and staring right at me. I wanted to look away, to close my eyes and make it all go away, but I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped in that moment, with those dead eyes locked onto mine. And then one of them moved. It was just a small movement, a twitch of the mouth, but it was enough to snap me out of my trance. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and that's when I heard the door creak open behind me. The footsteps I'd been hearing were now inside the room. I could feel a presence, cold and malevolent, moving towards me. The room filled with the sound of children's whispers, indistinct but filled with malice. They were taunting me, mocking me for breaking the rules. I tried to turn on the monitors, hoping to see what was happening, but all the screens showed static. And then, one by one, the dolls from the doll room appeared on the screens. They were no longer sitting idly in their display cases. They were standing, facing the camera, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, and their eyes, those glassy dead eyes, were staring straight at me. The whispers grew louder until they were deafening, and the lights flickered violently. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or look away from the screens. Then all at once, everything went dark. The whispers stopped, the footsteps ceased, and the temperature returned to normal. When the lights finally came back on, I was alone in the room. The blinds were down, the door was closed, and everything seemed normal again, except for one thing. The clock on the wall had stopped at 3 a.m. I didn't know how long I'd been sitting there, but it felt like hours. I bolted out of the museum as soon as my shift ended, not even waiting for the next guard to show up. The next day, I handed in my resignation. I didn't care about the pay or the benefits. Nothing was worth going through that again. But the nightmare didn't end there. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and relentless paranoia. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those faces, those hollow, lifeless faces, staring back at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something had followed me home. I started seeing shadows moving in the corners of my vision, hearing faint whispers in the dead of night. It got to the point where I couldn't even stay in my own house. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that the dolls from the museum were standing at the foot of my bed, their dead eyes watching me as I slept. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew better. I had broken the rules, and now I was paying the price. I reached out to some of the other guards who had worked at the museum, hoping they could help me make sense of what had happened. But none of them would talk to me. It was like they knew what I was going through, but they were too afraid to acknowledge it. One guy, an older guard who had been there for years, just looked at me with this haunted expression and said, "Some things are better left alone." That was the last conversation I had with anyone from the museum. After that, I cut all ties and tried to move on with my life. But the nightmares continued, and the sense of dread never really went away. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I finally understood what had happened. I was at a bar trying to drink away the memories when I overheard a conversation between two guys at the table next to me. They were talking about the museum, about how it was cursed, about the strange occurrences that had been happening there for over a century. One of them mentioned the rules, the same rules I had been given, and how breaking them could unleash something terrible. That's when it hit me. The rules weren't just some old tradition. They were there to protect us from whatever evil lurks in that museum. And I had broken one of them. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat there in the dark, thinking about what I had done. The realization that I had brought this on myself was almost too much to bear. But what could I do? I couldn't go back in time and undo what I'd done. I was stuck with the consequences of my actions. In the weeks that followed, I became a shell of my former self. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't function. The fear was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, waiting to pounce the moment I let my guard down. I started to lose weight, my hair began to fall out, and I developed this nervous twitch that I couldn't control. I was falling apart, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Then one night, it all came to a head. I was sitting in my living room trying to distract myself with some mindless TV when the light suddenly went out. My heart skipped a beat, and I immediately reached for the flashlight I kept next to the couch. But when I turned it on, the beam flickered and then died, plunging me into complete darkness. That's when I heard it, the sound of tiny footsteps, just like the ones I'd heard in the museum. They were coming from the hallway, slowly getting closer and closer. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the flashlight, but I managed to fumble for my phone and dial 911. But before I could press call, the phone was ripped from my hands by an unseen force, and I was thrown across the room. I hit the wall hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I tried to scramble to my feet, but something was holding me down, pinning me to the floor. The footsteps were right next to me now, and I could feel a cold breath on the back of my neck. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or scream. Then the whispers started. They were the same whispers I had heard in the museum, but this time they were louder, more insistent. They were telling me things, horrible things, things that no one should ever have to hear. They told me that I had been marked, that I would never be free, that the darkness would follow me wherever I went. I don't know how long it lasted, minutes, hours, I couldn't tell. But when it was finally over, I was lying on the floor in a puddle of my own sweat and tears. The lights were back on, the TV was still playing, and everything looked normal. But I knew better. I knew that nothing would ever be normal again. After that night, I stopped sleeping altogether. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel them watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. I started drinking heavily, trying to numb the fear, but it only made things worse. The nightmares started bleeding into my waking life, and I couldn't tell what was real and what was just my imagination. It got so bad that I ended up in the hospital. The doctor said I was suffering from severe anxiety and exhaustion, and they put me on a bunch of medications to help me cope. But nothing helped. The fear was still there, always lurking in the background no matter how many pills I took. Eventually, I realized that I couldn't live like this anymore. I had to do something, anything, to make it stop. So I went back to the museum. It was a stupid, reckless decision, but I was desperate. I thought that maybe if I confronted whatever was haunting me, I could finally find some peace. So one night I broke in. The museum was just as I remembered it, dark, eerie, and full of secrets. I made my way to the security room, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was still locked, just as I had left it. I took a deep breath, unlocked it, and stepped inside. Everything looked the same, the monitors, the desk, the Bible. But there was something different about the room, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and I could feel eyes on me watching my every move. I walked over to the desk, my hands shaking as I reached for the Bible. It was open to the same marked page as before. I hesitated for a moment, then forced myself to read the passage. It was a psalm, something about protection from evil. But as I read the words, they seemed to twist and warp on the page, turning into something dark and malevolent. I dropped the Bible, my heart racing, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the corner of the room just like before. It was the woman, the one I had seen on that first night. But this time she wasn't crying. She was smiling, a cold, cruel smile that sent shivers down my spine. I backed away, but she stepped closer, her hollow eyes locked onto mine. I could feel the darkness closing in around me, suffocating me, pulling me down into the abyss. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the security room, the clock on the wall frozen at 3 a.m. The woman was gone, but the fear was still there, gnawing at me, consuming me from the inside out. I don't remember how I got home that night. All I know is that I never went back to the museum. I packed up my things, left town, and never looked back. But even now, months later, the fear hasn't gone away. It's with me every day, every night, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment when I'll slip up and break another rule. I can't escape it no matter how hard I try. So, if you ever find yourself working in a place with rules like these, take them seriously. Because once you break them, there's no going back. I learned that the hard way, and now I'm living with the consequences. My life will never be the same. I'll never be the same. I've seen things that no one should ever have to see, experienced things that no one should ever have to experience. And I'm sharing this with you in the hope that maybe, just maybe, someone out there can avoid the same fate. Because once you open that door, once you break the rules, you can never go back. You can never undo what's been done. And trust me, you don't want to find out what happens when you do.